The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you so much, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, a podcast bringing you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing. Each week, we discuss trending topics and industry best practices. And this week, as we are in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, we are trying extra hard to get you even more timely information. So this week, we are pleased to welcome back Siegfried Schmitt. He has been a past guest on the podcast and is here once again this week to talk to us about the supply chain, management of the supply chain in times of uncertainty, certainly like the times we are in right now. And we hear about shortages, with lots of different products currently. And so I am so happy to welcome you back to talk about that with us today, Siegfried.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Nice to be back here.
Excellent. And I hope that you are healthy and well.
All is fine, thank you. And I hope it's the same with our listeners.
Yes, so do I. So we're going to hop right into this because I think this is such a timely subject. And supply chains for medicines and medical devices are often global, as we're seeing right now, and highly complex. So although we do not yet seem to have any drug shortages during this caused by COVID-19, we are hearing about a lot of other shortages, especially around personal protective equipment, and then some everyday supplies, toilet paper, paper towels, etc., and even viral testing kits. So I wanted to get your input on this, Siegfried. Why do you think we are in this situation currently?
So, though we had several incidences in recent years that had a massive impact on the supply chain, like the Icelandic volcano eruption or the hurricanes in the Americas, to name just two, they did not necessarily result in the same shortages and not on such a global scale. They were just having a different type of impact. They were more localized and people could still go to work, whereas now they can't. So we have a completely different scenario here. Yeah. And so we need to take this into account.
Sure. Absolutely. That's a great point. And it seems that there is a real difference here between devices and drugs. Is that correct? And if so, why the disparity?
Well, I think the main reason for the disparity is because of the lead times to manufacture either a device or a drug. Let's look at the devices. Typically, devices can be produced in days, weeks, perhaps months, but they are very quick to manufacture and to put on the market. But when you look at drugs, we are talking about very different timescales. We are looking at from starting material to finished product at months, sometimes even years. So what happens is that drug manufacturers build up stocks that last typically much, much longer than those for devices because of the lead times to get them ready and put on the market. So this is what we are also seeing now, I think, because we don't hear a lot about drug shortages yet, but we hear a lot about shortages with, as you said, personal protective equipment and so on.
Right. So that makes sense. So there's just a lot more drug supply already in the pipeline, so to speak. So it's
Yes.
We haven't really felt the impact yet. So depending on the length of this, how long this isolation goes on, we may start to that may start to change.
I suppose it will, because what we do see is that of course, there is a need for cures or for many things to treat these virus outbreaks. And therefore, we need to have a focus on these products. Which means, of course, that other products aren't necessarily being manufactured because there's a priority now. Plus, we do have supply chain interruptions. We know that a lot of raw materials, APIs, and so on come from Asia, and there is just no transport of many of these drugs, and there's also often no production of these raw materials. So we are very likely to see interruptions later this year, maybe, or next year.
Okay, thank you. We'll have to keep our eye on that for sure. But in the midst of all of this, it does seem to me that regulators are understanding the industry's predicament and relaxing some of the rules and requirements that have been in place for the manufacture of some things, such as masks, as we've seen in the news the last few weeks, especially for testing potential cures and clinical trials too. I think you and I were chatting about that offline a little bit, or for the registration of new devices such as ventilators. Do you think all of these efforts will be enough to keep us on track?
Well, it's certainly extremely helpful. And it's all over the world that the regulators are very, very supportive in every respect to bring these urgently needed devices onto the market and also the drugs.
Right.
But they do have, of course, still to ensure that whatever is being placed on the market, i.e. is being used by the personnel in hospitals, is being used by patients, is still safe and of the right quality. So it is not possible to bring a drug onto the market within weeks. It won't be possible, but it will definitely be expedited as much as it can be. So what there is a concern, of course, also is, are there any companies that try to take advantage of this leniency by the agencies? Meaning, will they compromise quality? Will they compromise testing and so on? So I believe in the end, we will only have those companies that still stick to the good ethics to have the right quality and the right product survive with all of this. We will have the odd ones out, but they won't persist.
Okay. So that's definitely a concern of mine as I read through a lot of these news stories and listen to experts talk on these subjects, because I am seeing companies like Under Armour and Nike stepping up to make masks, as one example. Or I was reading another article about the FDA putting new guidance out there in terms of companies making hand sanitizer, which is another product that we've seen huge shortages for. And there can be lots of variations in terms of suppliers, materials, the origins of the materials being used, a lot of them not being tested necessarily in the case of hand sanitizer, for human contact on their skin, whatever. So there's just all of these variables, and I get the need to move quickly. And I agree that we do need to relax our standards, not in terms of quality, but in terms of maybe timeline to get things out there. But I am a bit leery, I guess, of the impact that the potential impact on the long-term quality, if not the short-term quality.
Yeah. So
that at all?
I think what all the agencies are trying to do is to make sure that there is sufficient testing. Now, it is quite important. You see, take, for example, these COVID tests. You don't want a test that gives you false positives. So you would have people in hospital that don't need to be there.
Right.
But much worse, to have false negatives when someone is infected and shouldn't go out. So it is quite important for the regulators to still have assurance that these products work and work correctly. There is, of course, the big problem that so many things can be bought over the internet and people are scared. So people need to make sure they don't just buy something from whoever, but that they stick to the regulated supply chain, to those products that are approved by FDA and so on. So we need to also play our part in it. It's not just the providers, the healthcare companies, it's also us consumers making sure we do the right things. So in the end, again, I say there may be some black sheep now, but because of complaints, because of the regulators, in the long term, only those companies that produce the right quality and deliver the right things will survive.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I would hope that that's the case. I mean, I know there's a lot of fraud happening out there, in terms of people developing, making a company really quick to sell, for example, the masks, because I was reading a couple of articles about this. 3M has even put out statements saying, that there are people posing as sales reps from 3M who are putting low quality, ineffective masks out there for sale. And I think that it may be obvious to hospitals and labs who are used to buying their products from, certain places, but consumers really, there's a different risk there because they're not knowledgeable necessarily in sourcing these kinds of products. And when they see them online, they sometimes wrongly assume that the product that's being advertised is the product they're getting. And that's not always the case.
That is unfortunately true, indeed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm hoping that a lot of these products will, that are maybe out there right now as we're in sort of fear mode here, will not last. that they won't still be there in a few weeks. So we'll keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah.
But so the US is not alone, obviously, and the UK is not alone in terms of the shortages that are out there. We're seeing this as it's a global issue. Many countries have found that they're importing drugs and devices, maybe that they weren't before, or maybe maybe that's just part of their routine, but maybe they're doing it to a much greater extent than they've had to before, because of the shortage, because of the supply shortage, and their urgent needs that we're all facing. So do you think post-COVID-19, or maybe in the midst even, that this is going to be cause for us to rethink as an industry, whether we as a country should be manufacturing our products, whether they're devices, drugs, or other products, more locally in the future?
Well, you're absolutely right, Stacey. There have been lots of calls, especially by politicians, saying, well, we have to bring it all home. Don't import it. Don't buy it from other countries, especially in Asia. But you see, we definitely need, as an industry, assess whether this is the sensible thing, the current supply chain. And this is not just about the raw materials. This is also about the whole process. It's the resources. Because, you see, 30 years ago, what was just described, to have things in-house, to have things in the country, was more or less the routine. You would have these companies vertically integrated, which from R&D through the manufacture of the drug substance to the drug product and the sales and everything was all within one company. But then this all got distributed. And now we have these extremely complex supply chains that involve half the world. So the reason for that was not just the cost of labor. there were many reasons. There were also reasons about the regulations. If the regulations become too harsh, too uncompetitive, then companies will move. And so that was one thing. Then the source of the raw materials, the closeness to the raw materials, and so on. So when we look at the situation for the future, well, even if you could bring a lot of these manufacturers, be it, say, for personal protective equipment, back home, back to the US, to the UK, or wherever, it doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to do, because you may not have all the resources you want, all the resources you need. And of course, it's not just the industry, it's also the politicians, the agencies that need to provide a climate that supports that.
Right.
And in the end, we have to be clear, industry has to make a profit. If you cannot make a profit from producing these masks in, say, Michigan, then they won't do it.
Right.
So it's maybe now where you can demand almost any price for it, but for the future, that may not be the right model.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And if we are, as a country, looking to maybe do a little bit more homegrown production, then we're going to have to rethink the entire economic system in some countries, because not all climates, to your point, are favorable for manufacturing. Let's say. I know that is the case in the U.S. It's really hard to be a manufacturer here and follow all the rules and pay the right wages and do all these things and still make a profit, which is why we've seen so much of our manufacturing go elsewhere. So, right. I that was a great answer. I hadn't thought about it in those terms yet, but that's definitely something to think about for the future. So, in follow-up, I know we talked a little bit about this already, but with drug makers focused, a lot of them focused right now on COVID-19 treatments, vaccines, antivirals, and device manufacturers too, motivated to meet demands of PPE, test kits, and other necessary supplies. Do you anticipate a much larger impact to the entire industry long term? I mean, I know we already mentioned there may be drug shortages down the road, and we certainly have some product shortages now, but I'm thinking more long term. So if you could speak to that and the effect, maybe the trickle down effect that these shortages will have, going forward.
I think there will be drastic changes coming, and there are several reasons for that. One of the reasons is within the supply chain, we have an awful lot of small and medium-sized companies. You probably have ordered things from Amazon, and it's this nice guy who delivers it to your door, but he's not necessarily an employee of Amazon. He's just one of the subcontractors and so on. So there are lots of those out there who are involved in these supply chains. And not all of them will survive this pandemic.
Right.
That is one thing. And so the other thing is that even companies, larger companies that will survive, will they have the means to continue as they have done before? We don't know that yet. But what companies will need to do in any case is to establish their supply chain maps to understand what is possible, what is not possible, who is actually involved, who is not. And I think this is where we see an awful lot of gaps still with industry, where they're happily doing what they do day in, day out until we have such an interruption. And although they may understand what has happened to their current supply chain, they haven't really looked at what are the alternatives. Where else could I go? What else could I do? Who could I involve instead? And this is where we do need to have a change in industry to understand all this.
Yes. And I mean, I'm just thinking about so many things, so many companies who are scrambling right now, and they may think, well, this is just going to pass. Certainly, how many times have we lived through a pandemic, right? of this magnitude, though. I mean, we've had many many viruses and diseases that have come and gone. But I think, at least as far as I'm concerned, this is the first time I remember anything hitting the entire world with this type of impact for this period of time. So as you talk about and give examples of what the industry should do, or maybe what have they learned from things that have happened in the past or things that are happening right now, preparing supply chain maps, assessing associated risks, all of that, I think it's at the top of people's minds right now. And so as they're thinking about this, where can you direct them to find information on how to do these things? And, perhaps they have some time to figure this out and come up with a new plan.
Well, you're right, certainly, because a lot of things have slowed down. Yes, there is some time to look at exactly these supply chain maps. Now, where to find the information? There are regulations on good distribution practice, or good supply practice, as they call it in Asia. And there are also some articles that you can find online, many of them free. Mm-hmm. But what is really missing in those is practical advice, how to go about things. The regulations tell you need to do something, but not how to. And so, because of the situation, that there was no real reference book on the topic, last year I was in the nice position to be the editor of a book on this topic, which was published under the title Good Distribution Practice, a Handbook for Healthcare Manufacturers and Suppliers. And it came out in 2 volumes, and it is available from www.pda.org/bookstore, or you can go to Amazon. Now, why do I say this is a book that should be used as a reference? It's because it is extremely comprehensive. It covers the good distribution practice regulations globally, including those from China, which are not available in English. It covers what is really important in Europe, the qualified person and the responsible person who need to be in place if you are in the business. Or how do you make sure that supply chain, good distribution practice, which includes warehousing, shipment, and all this, how do you put this in your quality system? Making sure all of this is in place for your life cycle, because we start with raw materials, we start with equipment. Everything that goes into your manufacture, into your distribution, needs to be considered. And then what you often have to do is to do a risk assessment. So again, this book gives examples how to apply risk assessment to your supply chain. And finally, there is even a good distribution practice checklist that people can use. And so all of this, it wasn't just written by me, it was written by 24 industry experts from around the world, from all types of organizations. So this is where I think, at least for the moment, this is the best place to find reference material, practical material for use.
Thank you for mentioning that. I think that's such a great resource, and one that I'm definitely going to share with our listeners. We'll include links to where to view it online and then purchase it should they need to, because I work in the industry, and I know that the how-tos, the hands-on, tutorial kind of stuff is so much more effective and helpful to the users than just having the guidances, which are very vague. They tell you, what their expectations are, but not really how to get there. So this is great. And I know that book that you're referring to, I've had a chance to look through it myself. And I know you have a chapter in there that discusses managing incoming goods and materials, which is really kind of part of what we're talking about today in terms of supply chain. So in your experience, are there ways that you can stay lean as a company, but still ensure that you have adequate supply in times of need, like we're experiencing right now?
Certainly. See, you can always learn from the bad examples, but also from the good ones. But the bad, not the worst, but the bad examples, what I see there is that process flows cross, material flows cross. So incoming and outgoing goods cross over each other. They involve a lot of paper documentation, lots of transcripts from paper to electronic systems. And what this means is that all these processes are suboptimal. So when we look at good examples where you have lean, efficient, effective processes, what they do is they use the electronic tools. For example, tablets. There is, if possible, not a piece of paper. Of course, it won't happen completely paperless, but so the information, like the checklist for incoming goods, there is not a tick list where you use a pen and paper. You use a tablet and tick it off there. And the data is then directly transferred into the management systems. And these efficiencies can be achieved on any scale, on any type of good. So this is something personal protective equipment manufacturers should heed as much as someone who manufactures drugs.
Excellent. Great information. And there's much more of that type of information in your 2 volumes of your book. I'm curious because I did note that both books are for not just manufacturers, but also suppliers. So can you be a little bit more specific about what the readers would expect to find in terms of content and how it applies to both manufacturer and suppliers?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think manufacturers, that is almost self-explanatory.
Sure.
What they have to look for. And it's pretty well known also in industry. But let's talk a little bit more about the suppliers, because suppliers, you will be surprised how many suppliers an average company has. So an average pharma company has several hundred suppliers on their list. And this is staggering. And it may be just small things they get from them, like maintenance services and so on, but there are lots. But these suppliers themselves, do they have the right understanding of what they have to provide? So we have suppliers of, let's say, packaging materials, warehouses, and similar. But so what we know is, for example, road transport is very well organized. We all know the main transport companies. We've seen them, DHL, USB, and so on. And there are many others. And it's pretty cool, and they know what they're doing.
Sure.
But then when you look at air freight or you look at ocean shipping, it's a completely different story. It is a completely different world, because typically, if you only have a few containers on a container ship with thousands of containers, they are not really interested in you as a client.
Of course.
You see?
Yes,
it is a very different
story.
So what we have to deal with here is a sort of an education for the suppliers as well. And for suppliers, this can really be a great business advantage if they can provide traceability of the goods, if you know where your masks are at any given time or where your drugs are being held, in which warehouse, at what temperature. So this is something that is really well described in these books, how these companies, how the suppliers can provide the services that really set them apart.
Sounds like, right, some great tips and strategies and real actionable items for them to really increase their value in terms of what they're bringing to the table as a supplier. So excellent. Siegfried, this is some great information. I appreciate you making yourself available today to talk about this issue. It is so timely. And I'm happy to share your resource with our listeners so that they can get a leg up as well. Before we end today, can you leave our listeners with a few strategies or tactics for identifying future-proof supply chain solutions and making strides to improve today?
Well, I'd say implement a robust supply chain and be prepared for interruptions. They will happen.
Yes.
And it's best not just to plan for them, but to test them in anger. And perhaps the current situation made a lot of companies test them in anger.
Yeah.
So voluntarily or not,
That's
do
right.
it.
Ready or not.
That's my guess. That's my advice. Okay.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Siegfried. I really do appreciate you being here with us today. And to our listeners, you can find Siegfried's book, Good Distribution Practice, a handbook for healthcare manufacturers and suppliers, published in 2 volumes, as we mentioned. That is available at DHI Books, the PDA bookstore, and of course, Amazon.com. And we will include links to each of those outlets in our show notes, so be sure to check there for those. I want to, in closing, give a big thank you to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, as well as a huge thank you to our guest today, Siegfried Schmitt. I also want to give a big shout out to all our valued listeners who've been tuning in. As always, remember, if you like Voices and Validation, we encourage you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode. And we really appreciate it if you share it with your colleagues and your online networks, especially your online networks these days, as most of us are working remotely. For more information on the podcast and links from today's show notes, including the links to Siegfried's book, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We will be back again next week with more great interviews. Until then, stay healthy and well.
Thank you, Stacey. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.